Listen, thank you so much, first of all, for being here. I know for those of you who are pastors, your job seems to be never ending. There's never a place where it kind of gets turned off. It's always turned on. And so for you to take the time to join with me for a couple hours this afternoon, I just want you to know I'm honored that you're doing that. And I'm honored to be here. I hear some good things are happening with men. Keith has convinced me of that. And last night we had a chance just to talk about some of the things that are kind of stirring in your community. And that's where I want to be. I want to be where there are pastors who want to win with their men. And that's why I'm here today, to help maybe facilitate a little bit of that. I think what we'll do in the time we have together, I want to give you kind of a big picture sense of where the church is with men. And then after I finish, maybe we can just have some Q&A and kind of process together. Would that be okay with everybody? Because I don't want you to walk out of here with just some exhortation. I want you to walk out of here with some personal applications where you've listened, you've said, okay, here's where I am, here's what I'm experiencing. What would you do? Or how would you handle this? Or where is there a resource? And as best I can, I'll be able to address some of that. And either myself or Keith, we can speak to you that, because we want you to leave here feeling encouraged. I mean, if there's anything I want you to feel in our time that we have together, it's encouraged. And I want to say, Danny, thank you for opening up your church and hosting us here today. Very gracious to do that for us. Years ago, my father-in-law was a history professor. And as he got older and began to kind of finish out his career as dean of the history department there at Louisiana Tech, he started giving me some of his library. And he said, here's some books that you would really enjoy reading. And one of the first books he gave me was the book by Winston Churchill called The Gathering Storm. And The Gathering Storm is just the chronicle of Churchill's experience with his country, Britain, in the late 1930s, when Hitler and Nazism was rising and casting its shadow over Europe. And the book is simply about, which kind of chronicles what we're experiencing today a little bit with Iran. It chronicles Churchill's repeated pleas to his country to take note of this rising menace to the east of Britain. And in it was Europe's consistent refusal to deal with something that one day they were going to have to deal with on a much greater level by not dealing with it when it was just simply a shadow. And I mention that because I think today in America, we're facing a similar gathering storm. It's not a menace like our growing debt problem, although that's a big issue, isn't it? It's not the menace of Islamic fundamentalism or ISIS or the treaty that we're right now involved in, whether you like that or not. But the gathering storm I want to talk to you about is about the growing masculine meltdown that's taking place in our country. It's one that if you care to look at it and notice, it's everywhere. It's something that we should be able to see, but unfortunately, most of us don't see it. And I think it's because we just don't want to know it's there. We want to turn a blind eye to it. And I think in some ways the church has turned a blind eye as well. And as I travel across the country, you can see that blind eye just simply in the way churches are structured. So for instance, if I were to go into ex-Baptist church in any place in the country, or ex-Presbyterian church, or ex-Methodist church, or ex-Bible church, one of the things you'll see as you look at the structure, and as a pastor I look at structures, you'll see that they have well-developed women's ministries, right? They have well-developed youth ministries, good budgets towards that. Great Sunday school program, great missions ministry, great music ministry, funded, staffed. But then you ask the question, where's your men's ministry? And 9 times out of 10, when you ask that question, there's just simply silence. Or the pastor will say, well, occasionally we do a men's retreat. Or we have a pancake breakfast, or some hunting conference where we draw men in and we have a special speaker. But usually those ministries, those momentary ministries on the calendar, don't have any real staff behind them, and they have a very limited budget. They just simply come and go. Am I right? That's not just in your area. That's everywhere around America. And by the very sense of where we put our staff and our money, we make a statement. And the statement is, men aren't that important. And I don't see what's really happening in America today. Because if I did, things would change in the way things are actually structured. That's an unbelievable miss, guys, for the American church today. And that miss is creating a great mess. On the other hand, if churches were to step up and seize that opportunity, it would be the great opportunity of advancing the kingdom in ways maybe we don't understand that I'd like to share with you here today. Because men who are clued in on what it means to be a godly man, they understand the compelling vision of what masculinity is. They can tell you, most guys can't even tell you what a man is, much less a biblical man. And as I always tell dads, it's hard for you to call your son up to manhood if you can't define it. But that's where we are today. But if men have a compelling vision, if they are taught practical how-tos to live out that biblical vision of masculinity, it is unbelievable what men can do and how they can change not only the face of a church, but of the face of the community. On the other hand, if we continue to turn a blind eye to a gathering storm, we're no different than where Winston Churchill was in the 1930s as he saw this gathering storm. We're in big trouble, and there's going to be hell to pay for it. Churchill often said that he felt desperately alone as he cried out to his countrymen, "There's danger up ahead." And sometimes I feel exactly the same way traveling across the country. I spoke at a huge Lifeway convention with 10,000 guys and spoke to pastors. And no matter how much you tell them men are important, what they hear, and maybe what you'll hear at the very beginning, so I want to dismiss it right here at the start, maybe what you'll hear is just, well, he's going to tell me I got more to do. And I've already got so much to do, I can't take on anything else. And this is just another thing to put in the agenda, and my people are already too busy. Well, I want to dispel that. I don't want to give you more to do. I just want to give you a few right things that have to be done if we're going to face this gathering storm. As I've been traveling across the country, I've seen firsthand what I call the warning lights from our community, that real men and real manhood is disappearing from the American landscape. Men more and more are cited to be the troubled gender. That's us. Half the population, we're the troubled gender. And every day in the paper, as you look at crime or you look at tragedies or you look at statistics, most of that is on the shoulders of lost, confused, visionless men who most of the time grew up under dads who either weren't there or who are lost and confused themselves. And a lot of those guys are sitting in our churches, needing a vision and a reason to step up to real manhood. Let me give you just some stats, and I don't want to overwhelm you with some statistics, but I just want you to feel where we really are, because most of us can get in our car and truck and go through a week with the responsibilities that we have and the things we're feeling and never even sense this is going on around us. But anybody that just simply takes the time to just look a little bit under the hood and ask the question, what is happening with men, you would be amazed at what you would find. Now, these things aren't hard to find if you're looking for them, but for most of them, we don't even know they're around. For instance, let me just give you 3 examples. Did you know that young heterosexual males are fast becoming a very real threat to traditional marriage, to the existence of traditional marriage? And you go, I hadn't heard that. See, most of us, we're focused more on this great social upheaval that just recently took place when gay marriages were legalized. That's the conversation in the hallway or around the water cooler, because we're undergoing this huge social change in America today. But here's what I want you to hear. Homosexual unions are no threat to traditional marriage. Zero. They're a sideshow that has nothing to do with the real issue, the real storm that's gathering in America today. The real threat to traditional marriage are the growing numbers of clueless, unprincipled, heterosexual young men, many in our own churches, who lack no compelling vision for getting married. Did you know that? For some of you, I hadn't heard that. But as a result, these men, especially those in some of the more middle-class communities of America, what's happening with those young men is they're simply not marrying. They're choosing instead to cohabit or just simply remain single. Last month, the book came out on the future of America by the Pew Foundation. And one of the things they pointed out was this, that among millennials, and millennials are young men 18 to 29, among millennials, most believe, 44%, that marriage is now obsolete. It's a dinosaur. It's not something to pursue. It's something to walk away from. And as a result, I don't know if you saw this in the paper, but for the first time in American history, more Americans in America are unmarried for the very first time than are married. And that percentage is growing. A fact that sociologist Brad Wilcox of the University of Virginia calls a very real danger to the future of American society. So why is marriage declining? 2 reasons. Mainly because today's young men no longer see marriage as commendable, as desired, as necessary, or as a priority, especially when they can just move in, sleep around, and when the responsibilities get too big, walk away. That's how young men think today. When they see marriage not as something to be pursued, but as a burden that doesn't work. Now listen, that's not true, but that's what's on the streets. That's how guys are thinking. And something has to move them to shift their stance and position. Otherwise, this percentage is simply going to grow. Marriage is not something to be pursued. And then there's an additional factor. To that, there's this. Women in lower and middle class communities, according to a number of surveys, no longer believe in young men. I'm going to give a quote from this survey. It's a scholarly study out of Dartmouth. Here's what it says. Women in middle class and lower class communities no longer think it's realistic to depend on men in their lives. They have seen or experienced too much infidelity, too much divorce, and too many bad behaviors from young men to think that they can trust or rely on men as a life partner. And with their new economic freedom of moving into the workplace and providing for themselves to some level, they don't need men. And that statistic's only going to grow. So there it is. Clueless, unprincipled young males are the growing menace to marriage. But in most churches, we'll focus over the gay group. The small percentage, 5% or less, who are making a lot of noise but are going nowhere, while the real percentage sitting right in front of us are wandering around with no vision to create civilization for the next generation. Because they can't think that high. They can only think this low. That's where we are today. And yet, if they just simply knew some facts, it could help them. For instance, did you know that married men are way happier than unmarried men? Every social statistic will tell you that. Did you know that married men are better adjusted than unmarried men? That they live longer? That they're healthier? That they feel a greater sense of life satisfaction and purpose by being married and more productive? That's the general consensus. The happiest men in America are married. The most productive men in America are married. And the men who will leave the greatest legacy in the next generation are those who are married. But the young guy walking the streets, he is clueless about that kind of information. He's just trying to make it today. And because of that, marriage in America is in real trouble. Here's a second example. What about today's crisis with kids without dads? Now that's closer to home, and a lot of us know that. It's hard for me to imagine that 40%, over 40% of all kids don't even have dad around. It's not that he's got a clueless dad. He doesn't even have dad there. 40%. Look at any classroom. My daughter's a school teacher. She can look out on the first day of school, she told me, as any other teacher can. And within 30 minutes, she can tell me which kids have dads and which kids don't. Just by looking at them and watching their activity. But here's the thing that's scary. Remember millennials, 18 to 29? Among millennials in America today, our next generation, 64% of all young women in the millennial category will give birth at least once out of wedlock. That's 6 out of 10 will give birth out of wedlock in the coming generation. It led one social research team to conclude this. And here's what they said. Single mothers are now becoming the new normal in the 21st century. The new normal. Think about that. The new normal. I don't know about you as I deal with families, but that's anything but normal. And not only that, the impact on children without dads is not only not normal, it's devastating. And again, we've got reams of statistics. 71% of all high school dropouts, kids without dads. 75% of all adolescents who have drug and alcohol problems, they don't have a dad. 85% of all teenagers with behavioral problems grow up in a home without a dad. 80% of all prison inmates didn't have a father at home. That's America. My youngest daughter just took on last year 2 foster kids from a meth trailer, from a mom who has 2 different dads that we had to go to court to find out their DNA to know which belonged to who. 3 and 4, these 2 little girls. Over the last year, I've got up close and personal watching these girls grow up. And they've made some significant progress. But guys, listen to me. The woundedness that's already there is tragic. When my daughter has to hold them at night because they fear abandonment. When she goes up with her boyfriend and puts her arm around him and one of the little girls goes crazy because she's so fearful of that man in my daughter's life. When they have flashbacks to being beaten, one of them with a rock on her buttocks. And those wounds go deep. And let me tell you, it will not take another year or 2 for those to go away. If my daughter ends up adopting those 2 girls, and we've talked about this, she will be dealing with these things for decades, trying to work out and leverage against those wounds that have been inflicted in just the first 3 or 4 years of life. Now, why do I tell you that? Because America's churning out hundreds of thousands of those kids every year into American society. The prophet Malachi was right. Without fathers, the land becomes cursed. And it becomes cursed with abandonment pain, cursed with self-loathing and shame in these kids that they'll bear sometimes for a lifetime, and cursed with revenge. Because let me tell you, hurt kids don't grow up. Hurt kids grow up and get even. That's where we are in America. Let's just leave one other little stat about men. This has to do with underachieving men. I don't know if you've noticed this, but men are stalling out and falling behind women educationally. 30% more women go to college and graduate now than men. Did you know that? Did you know some colleges are secretly recruiting young males to go to college to fill out the ranks, to get a better balance in the university? More women earn master's degrees than men. Much more. For the first time starting last year, more women earn PhDs than men in America today. I remember I was walking into Starbucks the other day, and I looked down. You know how Starbucks has certain newspapers and stuff displayed, mainly the New York Times, but there was the New York Times sitting there. And on the front page of the New York Times was a headline, and here's what the headline said. When it comes to college, women are leaving men behind in the dust. That was the headline. And what does that mean? What does that mean for the future of America? Here's what it means. It means that more women than men in the 21st century will become the primary breadwinners of their home. I already see that in my kids, in their generation. I see their wives already in the early parts of their careers. Almost every one of the kids I know, the wife either makes the same as the husband or more. And what that means is she's going to be the primary breadwinner. He's going to drop back a little bit, which is going to make the woman's job busier, more stressful, and harder than ever before as men fall further and further behind and take less and less initiative in the primary responsibilities of real manhood because their culture has deceived them. And they've capitulated to playing computer games and drifting along and letting their mother wife take care of them in the next generation. Boy, when I read stuff like that and see things in the spirit of Winston Churchill, I just want to go, America, church, danger is ahead. We need to wake up. If we keep doing business as usual, we may build good churches that look good, but the crying need is going unaddressed. The most primal, foundational need is just sitting there, fomenting and fermenting and getting infected even more, and we're doing nothing about it. We're not addressing it. And we know that because all we have to do is look at our church structures and we can see that nothing there for men. Or what is there is just pittance. That's where we are. And that's a dangerous place to be. Let me tell you, I go around and sometimes I do. I feel like Winston Churchill. I think we need two revolutionary concepts to convert the hearts of spiritual leaders and pastors. And I'd put myself in the same category. Here's the two things. First, we need to embrace, once again, at a deep soul level, the reality that men are primary to what rules over society. Now, I'm glad no women are in the room when I said that, okay? Because that's so politically incorrect, isn't it? That men are primary to what rules over a society. We've been raised in a feminist culture where we've lost sight of what we bring to the table. But let me tell you, the Scriptures don't. The Scriptures say that. It may not be politically correct, but the Bible says it is biblically correct. That God created man that way. That's why God created, by the way, and there was a lesson in this. It wasn't just a picture. It wasn't just, a story. The reason God created Adam before Eve, there was a reason he was created first, and then she came later. Because God was making a statement. He was signaling for all time that men and what men do will lead in the future of a society for good or for ill. They will lead. And no feminist rhetoric is going to cover that up. It's on the papers every day that men are still leading, sometimes in a bad way. But we set the tone of a culture as men, for good or for ill. I put it down in just a simple catchphrase. Here's the catchphrase that I tell guys all the time. As men go, so goes everything else. I thought it was interesting. One day I was doing some research and I came across Margaret Mead. That name for some of you young guys doesn't ring a bell, but in my day, Margaret Mead was the great social anthropologist of the world. She studied cultures and histories and civilizations, and she made incredible pronouncements of her summaries of what she saw in those cultures, sociologically speaking. And I ran across this statement by Margaret Mead. Big summary, 50,000-foot view of civilization. Here's what she said. She said this, I'm quoting her. The chief responsibility of every society, that gets your attention, doesn't it? From an anthropologist. The chief responsibility of every society is to get the men right. Now, that's not a pastor or a theologian. That's a secular anthropologist. Because as men go, so goes everything else. If men become confused, lost, misdirected, passive, which so many do, or troubled, or if they buy into a modern agenda that really is leading them nowhere, especially if that happens in large numbers, as we see today, the rest of society, no matter how hard it works, no matter what it does to make things right, it will not be able to do so. It's not going to work. You can only increase government assistance programs only so much. You can only build prisons only so big. You can only offer so many recovery programs for addicted people, only so much. And you can only ask hard-working women to only add to their agenda so much more. Eventually, just like debt, there's a limit to how far those things can go. Eventually, none of these good people or these good efforts to bolster the broken will work if real men keep disappearing. I think David, great David, had it right when he saw his society in his day crumbling under violence and greed and deceit and immorality. He just had a simple one-word cry. You can read it in Psalm 12:1. He just says, "Help, Lord, for the godly man ceases to be." He went primal. He went back to the original created social order. And he said, if things are going to be right, it's not going to be through programs and stuff like that, it's assistance. It's not going to be through women working harder, prisons, more police on the street. Those are good Band-Aids for a moment. But at the bottom, it's going to be one thing. It's going to be the reappearance of men of character and men who have a moral vision, a spiritual vision. So, men are primary to what rules over society. As men go, so goes everything else. And then second, and this is why I'm glad you're here, is this. As men are primary to the health of society, the church is primary. The church is primary to building real men. There is no other institution on planet Earth, certainly no institution in America, that is better positioned, better spread out, better rooted in communities to do what I just said than a local church. And not just in building men, but in transforming broken men, in redeeming all men, and giving them not just a temporal but an eternal vision for their life with specifics. There's no institution anywhere more positioned to make that happen than the local church. But the local church and the leadership of a local church has to finally recognize that there's a gathering storm. Otherwise, it's just business as usual. And it can look good and it can work well, but it doesn't forebode well in America. You know, I got my wake-up call about this in, of all places, 1990. I had a couple of friends, old fraternity friends, who were in our church, my church, and they took me out for dinner one day, and they said, you know, we like what's going on here at the church, but we think we need to do something for men. Now, these guys were good friends. We were really honest with each other, and they just said, there are things that we're dealing with that the church is not talking about. And so I began to ask them some things, and some things came up like, I'm struggling with my dad. Okay, well, I struggle with my dad. I didn't think to preach on it, but I struggled with my dad. He was an alcoholic. I struggled all the time growing up, me and my two brothers, under an alcoholic father. We said, I struggle with that. Another guy said, I struggle with friends. I feel like I had friends in college, but now that I'm in the work world, life is so fast, I just feel lonely. Everything's just high and by. Another guy's, I'm struggling with my marriage. You know, I got married, I've got a great woman, but there's just things I just keep feeling like I'm failing all the time. And I'd like to talk to another guy, but I think everybody else is doing good. By the way, that's the curse of most men. We think everybody's doing, or the other guy's doing good. You guys are sitting around the table, oh, these guys are doing good. I couldn't say anything. Let me tell you one thing I always like to tell guys, no one of us is doing good. And we think we should know, but a cardinal principle of growing up as a man is to realize you don't know. That's why you need to go get help. We all do. But those guys took me out and they said that, and I was sitting there listening to that, and so quite frankly, a lot of things they were saying, I was going, man, I'd like to have some answers to that. They were asking me to lead them. And so they stayed on me about that, and finally, in 1990, I took, because these were my fraternity brothers, I took the name from that and just started this little ministry called Men's Fraternity. And I thought we would explore manhood. And let me tell you, in 1990, there wasn't much out there on men. Anywhere. And I struggled all summer trying to put together some Bible studies or something that I could speak to them about. And I got 30 guys to meet with me in a little room. And I would do these little character studies and Bible studies on manhood. And they would listen. And someone would take notes and stuff. And I could tell I wasn't hitting the mark. Because I really hadn't dealt with my own manhood. So at the end of that time, I said, well, guys, is that what you want? We had this little men's study, and one of them was honest enough to say, no. Yeah, that's not it. So I went back to the drawing board and did some more research and made time for that. And over the next 2 years, I began to find things that really meant something to me. I realized how much my dad had hurt me. I didn't realize it. I didn't realize that one of the reasons I played middle linebacker for the University of Arkansas, and one of the reasons I worked 80-hour weeks for the church, at that time not a healthy thing, the reason I was doing all that is because I was trying to reclaim the family name because I was so ashamed of my dad. And I didn't have a name. I remember when I was a little kid going to the hardware store and asking for something and hearing the guys talk about my dad as a drunk. And I'd leave there seething inside with rage. And I'd say to myself as I walked out of the store, I'm going to be better than that. Now my other brothers took different paths. But my path, my chosen path to deal with my hurt was work. Be mad, be mean, be tough. Make it happen. Let me tell you, I did. I made it happen. But I wasn't happy inside. Because it wasn't coming out of healthiness. It was coming out of a wound. And during that research, I kind of got in touch with that and started dealing with it. And then I started sharing it with the guys. And lo and behold, when I'd share about the father wound, at the end of every session, tons of guys would get up. Some guys leading companies with 3-piece suits and top of the line look, and they would come down with snot all over their suit, weeping for the first time in their life because they had been looking for the love of a dad they'd never gotten. Let me tell you guys, it was huge. I had guys coming down saying to me, I wish I'd have heard this 20 years ago. My son hates me because I've never been there. I never connected. I provided everything he should ever have had. But he hates me. And I don't understand why. But today when I was listening, I realized I gave him everything but my heart. And that's what he wants. And I don't know what to do. And I could go on and on. I had guys who come down and say, my mom is still controlling my life and I'm 50 years old. I've always felt like she tells me what to do. I would have thought that was ridiculous. But I had tons of guys telling me about mom. And the overly bonded with mom wound, they were still suffering. And how it was invading their marriages. And then I had other guys just going, I don't know how to do anything. I fail all the time. And I think I'm supposed to know, so I work harder, but it only makes it worse. Is that making sense to everybody? Yeah. There are thousands of guys like that. It fills the majority of our churches. And secretly, they're living in this, wanting somehow to address it. And here are our churches with their budgets and staff and all that. And here's men's ministry at the end of the org chart, and it's not even a box, it's a dot. There are no staff there. There's a few dollars given for a retreat or a pancake breakfast. So they have to live in that silence and hear that they're supposed to be good men, but nobody's telling them how. That's where we are in America today, and the storm just keeps getting bigger and bigger because that's the best environment for men. Most of them are living on the street in a totally different world that's way worse than what I just described. And that's where we are in America. So I started doing that. And I started sharing those kind of things. And all of a sudden we went from 30 guys to 60 guys. And then when I really got my act together in about 1994, I remember driving up to the church for the new men's fraternity, and there were 300 guys there. And I knew I'd hit on something. And I was discovering it. By the way, the little series we did that year is called The Quest for Authentic Manhood, because I was really clear to guys, I'm on the quest. I don't know what I'm doing either. So we just lived it together. But the next year, it went from 300 to 600 guys. And by 1999, you could drive up to my church on Wednesday morning at 6 a.m. There were 1,400 guys in the auditorium. And let me tell you, it revolutionized my church. I was still preaching and stuff. I had to take some time away from some things to focus on the priority, men. But the amazing things that happened, guys, I just wanted to grab every pastor in America and say, I missed it. I wish somebody had told me this earlier. Because this is changing my church, and I began to see how much it changed my church. I saw men for the first time becoming honest with one another at a level I'd never heard before, and sharing, I need to do this, I need to learn this, I don't know, it's okay not to know. I saw men becoming self-starters. Large numbers of guys who, their wives would come up and say, man, he's taking initiative. He's learning some things that he's applying in the home, and he attaches it to being a real man and sharing his heart with me and that kind of thing. And guys are cheering for him, and it's making a huge difference. I couldn't go to any mall without women coming up and just saying, hey, whatever's going on there, keep it up. It's going great. I saw guys dealing with issues for the first time in their life. I'd have guys older men especially, coming up and saying, I don't know how to reconcile with my son. And so we'd come up with a plan. And then his small group would cheer for him. And he'd go meet with his son. And some of them had been carrying stuff their whole life. I remember one guy who was a good friend of mine. He had gotten divorced when his son was 12 years old. For the next 20 years, he tried to buy his way out of that with his son. Never worked. His son just got meaner, angrier, and ornerier. And so he talked to me about that, and I said, well, Bill, did you divorce your wife for the right reasons? And he said, no. I said, well, would it be good as the spiritual leader that you go confess your sin to your son and ask him to forgive you and to ask him to forgive you for all the secondary excuses you've offered and you tried to buy your way out of that with him? And he told me, he said, I don't know if I could do that. I said, well, let's pray together. And we prayed for about a week. And finally, he went to his son and did that. And his son immediately forgave him and said, Dad, I've been waiting for that for 20 years. Now, those are just little practical steps that have huge outcomes. But where does the guy learn that? Where does he get encouragement to do something like that? And I go, to me, the church is the most well-positioned group to do stuff like that. I saw guys do that. I saw them start their own ministries. I started seeing them sharing Christ and bringing other guys, and it just got bigger and bigger, and our community changed, our whole community. By the time I finished my last men's fraternity in 2001, we had over 15,000 men in the Little Rock community who'd gone through men's fraternity, and we were a fraternity. And you could feel it. And it resonates even to this day. I've seen that with other guys who've done men's ministry well, pastors who've taken the mantle well and seen what it's done in their churches, in their families, with their parenting, in their companies. I love that my son, my youngest son, is in a commercial real estate company where the top 3 guys who run that company are men's fraternity graduates. And they run the #1 commercial real estate firm by spiritual principles. And they will tell you they got those when they went through men's fraternity and found out being a Christian businessman was the right way to do it. So I share this with you because I want you to feel my passion for that. And can you imagine what would happen if we had churches, large numbers of churches in every city that had men as their priority, and the pastor was ensuring that they got some of the best of the church? Because let me tell you, for every one godly man who's really living it out, dozens of men are impacted. Jesus knew that, didn't he? That's why he chose 12 what? What gender did he choose? Why did he choose 12 men? I can tell you why. I can go back to Genesis and tell you why. Because as men go, so goes everything else. That's why he started there. And he shouted a message to the church by the men that he chose. So guys, we need a man-building revolution. Man-building revolution. And we need it right now. And the church is the key to making it happen. So how does that happen? Now I'm going to finish and we'll just open it up. How does it happen? Let me tell you how it happens. It happens when the church looks at itself in an X-ray. We look at the skeleton of the church, the structures of the church, and we decide that's not properly adjusted. And we need to make a few changes. And I told you earlier, I'm not going to lay a bunch of new things on you and make life heavier, but I want to mention a few structural changes that I think would be huge for any church. And I've seen churches do it, and I've seen the results. So here's the first one. Four changes I think would be tremendously helpful in the church. The first is the most radical, and that is the senior pastor must become the head of men's ministry. The senior pastor must become the head of men's ministry. Now, here's what I don't want you to hear. The senior pastor must do all of men's ministry. That's not what I'm saying. But men will never gain the status they need to have in a church unless the senior pastor authorizes it by taking this mantle on and being the promoter, the cheerleader, the illustrator, and the ensurer that a healthy men's ministry that in time will rival the women's ministry gets established. So it doesn't mean he does everything. It just means he's the head coach that makes sure that everything gets done. And that may mean nothing more than he finds a top young man or men to lead men's ministry and hires them, takes funds from here to here. It may mean that he finds great material and has a team vet the best of the material and implement them in the church. And then he stands up and advertises those things, talks about them, shares success stories of them. But it's constantly in front of the people until the people of the church can chant what the people of my church can chant. And that is, men are a priority here. Men are a priority here. And they get equal treatment here. They get equal budget here. They get equal staff here. And they get cheered for regularly here from the pulpit, from the head coach, who's the men's ministry leader. That's number one. Now, why do I tell you that? Because I've been with the National Coalition of Men's Ministries for almost 20 years. I go to their conventions. I hear the guys talk who are involved in men's ministry like Keith and others. And here's what I hear. Everywhere, we want to have a men's ministry. But our pastor's just not that interested. He'll tell us, you go do it. We get some pocket change to do it. And here's what the research tells us. If the senior pastor does not embrace this title and become the champion through his position, men's ministry, the chance of there being a vibrant men's ministry in that church are slim and none. That's just the truth. Here's the second thing that I think is a great structural move, if a pastor would do that. The second thing churches must do, they must repeatedly, relentlessly teach every year a course in the basics of biblical manhood. In the basics of biblical manhood. Not run away to the next course or the next book, but they need to set in place a course. It could be 10 weeks, it could be 20 weeks, I don't know what it is. But it is a course in the basics of biblical manhood in which that vision, that compelling vision of manhood is outlined and detailed. And the pastor could teach it, and if not the pastor, he needs to find somebody who is a compelling communicator and a team to deliver that to the men of the church. And here's what their goal is. Their goal is to get every man in the church to go through that course. And then next year, they teach the same course again, and they get every man who didn't go through that course, or who joined the church in that year, or who grew up and became a college-age student through the church's just age-graded network, to go into that course. And then the next year they do it again, and they do it again. It becomes a foundational fundamental of the church that every man in the church will have a language of biblical manhood that they can converse with one another on, and they know what the issues are to be a real man. And in time, what's going to happen is their kids are going to know it, their wife's going to know it, and everybody collectively will cheer for it. Did you know if you came to Little Rock, Arkansas and walked into Fellowship Bible Church, I can promise you that, and you walked up to anybody in our church that's a man and pulled him aside and just said this, have you been here for a while? Yeah. Have you been through men's ministry here for a while? And he said, yeah. Then I want you to tell me, what's the definition of a real man? I'll lay money they can answer it. Just like my son, when he was a 14-year-old, he was at Waffle House with his football buddies, and somehow they started making jokes about manhood, and somebody said, well, what is a man? And they just got quiet. And then my son Garrett said, I know. And somebody said, well, what's a man? He said, well, a real man is one who rejects passivity. He accepts responsibility for God's word, God's woman, God's work, God's world. He lives courageously above feelings, and the whole time he expects God's greater reward. That's what a man is. And everybody got quiet. And they said, where did you get that? Do you hear how crisp and clean that is? And he looked at his friends and he said, I got it from my dad, because that's what he's living for. Now, can you imagine a church that had that language? We talked about the father wound. It wasn't something, I mean, my kids, they have friends, and I'll say, how's Joey doing? Say, he's doing good, but Dad, he's got a deep father wound. They can analyze. They can say what they're living for, why God's word's important. They know all that stuff. Because it's a language of the church. And the reason it's the language of the church? Because we relentlessly, every year, teach the basics in biblical manhood. The Army's got a creed, no man left behind. Man, I wish the church had that creed. We don't want any man not having the opportunity to discover what God has for you as a man. Here's the third structural change. And by the way, as a pastor, you could hire to that. You could hire to it. Or you could find some outstanding man in your church who's a great communicator, who loves men, and just equip him with the right resources, and then commission him in front of the church and say, this is the leader of our men's ministry, and I'm his head coach, and we're going to change men's lives here. Third thing I would do is this. I would ensure that good fathering skills, including how to raise a boy to be a man, is taught to every dad every year. And I call that the dad class. And again, there's great materials already out there. But I would ensure that every dad, especially young dads, eventually you're going to catch up with the dads in your church, and so it'll only be geared towards young dads, but that every dad has fatherhood training, especially how to raise a boy to be a man, a game plan for 18 years before he leaves home. That material's out there, by the way. But I would insure it. And by the way, here's how strongly I would insure it. That if you bring your child to our Sunday school class, one of the things we're going to ask you every year, have you been through the dad class? And we're going to hound you until you do. The pastor will reinforce that when he's standing on Father's Day or whatever. He said, we have a dad class, and every man must go through this dad class. Not should, must. Because men need to learn how to be a father. And by the way, here's what I want you to hear. No man knows how to be a dad. It doesn't come with the title when they do put that child into your hands. So forget that the guy next to you knows how to be a good dad. He does not. He only learns how by training. So we want to make that a key component. And you can do that in your church. I don't have a problem with it. I teach at our church, even though I'm not on staff at our church, I teach the dad class every year. Okay, I come into the church 8 weeks. Last year, I had 200 dads. And we live in an affluent area of town, so I was telling the guys last night, we have a lot of doctors and lawyers and accountants and business entrepreneurs and stuff. 200 of these guys. They all had sons 7 to 12 years old for the class. And I was teaching them the basics of fatherhood. And then we would have an open forum where they could ask me questions. Here's what I discovered. That was the most clueless bunch of idiots I've ever been around. They didn't know anything about fatherhood. They were asking me things about what mom does, and they didn't want to get in the way of mom. And I was just sitting there listening and going, whoa, we got work to do here. But these guys are running companies. But they didn't know how to run their home. You know why? Because nobody told them. Nobody had trained them. Nobody had stepped up and said, this is serious stuff, and if you don't get this training now, one day, when your son's 30, you're going to be back here at the church crying your eyes out going, how did I miss it? But can you imagine if a church every year was cranking out informed dads with a game plan? What that would do for a church and even a community long term? When all of a sudden your high school football team and your cheer team and your academic team and your community is filled with young men who at least are healthy enough to stand up in a secular age for Jesus? Because they understand what that means. Here's the last thing. Churches must challenge and equip older men to mentor younger men in some aspect of godly manhood. I always laugh. I always used to ask older men, why don't you be a mentor? And most older men say, I don't know how to mentor. And I go, it's real easy. Just ask a young man to meet with you. That's it. And they go, what am I going to say? I hadn't done a good job. It doesn't matter if you didn't do a good job. Just ask a young man to meet with you and then share some of the things you've been learning. It may be all you're going to do is say, let's read a book together. It could be, let's watch this video series together and discuss it. And you just share your life with his. Listen, all the surveys say young men want older men to mentor them. I was with a guy working out at the athletic club the other day. Well, not the other day, it was last year, about this time of year. He's a doctor, and he said to me, I wish my 2 sons-in-law could go through the men's fraternity I went through. And I looked at him, he said, when are you going to teach the next one? I went, when am I going to teach the next one? Why don't you teach it? He said, I can't teach that material. I said, it's on video. All you have to do is, can you hit the on button? He said, yeah. And I said, then you can have a discussion. And the reason I tell you that, because just a few weeks ago, he called me and said, well, I did it. I said, what'd you do? He said, I mentored for 24 weeks my 2 sons-in-law in manhood. And he said, would you do us the honor of graduating us at a breakfast? And I said, sure. So I went to breakfast with them, and these 2 young men in their 20s both handed me one an 8-page, one a 10-page typed manhood plan with specific goals of how they were going to take their new definition of manhood, the one I quoted you a minute ago, and implement it with their wife, with their kids, at their workplace, and in their church. And wounds that they were going to get over because both of them were from divorced homes. And we finished, as those guys handed, I read those things, I went, this is incredible. And they turned to their father-in-law, they said, it's all because of him. It's all because of him. Now, can you imagine if we were doing the 4 things I just said in a church? And again, I'm not loading up the pastor. I'm just saying some structural changes. And so here you come to First Baptist, and there's a dad class out there. There's a basic manhood class out there. There's a mentoring where you just get with guys and then you have resources you could take them through just for a little short term. 6 weeks in this book, 4 weeks in that. I got a group of dads who are all CEOs. They meet with 30 young men every year for a year. And they mentor them on how to be a Christian and a great businessman at the same time. They mentor them in business leadership, and they get another 30 the next year. They've been doing it for 10 years in Little Rock. And one of the guys that they mentored, who has a business perspective and a godly perspective, is the guy that's my son's boss at that commercial real estate firm too. That's how you change a city. Because as men go, so goes everything else. But real men are disappearing. And there's a gathering storm. And we're going to have to go beyond doing business as usual. Because real men, guys, don't just happen. They don't just happen. Real men are made. And you know who they're made by? Other men. Through the local church, where the pastor understands the need of the hour in the 21st century is real men. And we need to teach them the basics in biblical masculinity. We need to teach them how to be a dad so they can transfer that truth to their son. And we need to get older men reaching down to younger men who are wandering around and pull them in and love on them with some truth. And here's what I want you to know. And you mark my words. If we don't do that, our country will not be here at the end of the 21st century. Have you felt how fast our country has changed in just the last 10 years? Do you feel, as David cried out, if the foundations be destroyed, what will the righteous do? Have you ever asked yourself, what are the foundations he's talking about? If you read these great commentators like I have, they'll all say the foundations David's referencing are the Genesis foundations of the Creator. And what are those? A man, a woman, marriage, parenting, reaching the world. If we don't address those, we're lost. So I want to tell you how much I appreciate you letting me bleed in front of you a little bit. But I do so because I really do believe nothing less than our country and our way of life is at stake. Thank you, guys.